Yeah, we're live. It's Friday night, and I'm even 4 minutes early, which is awesome. Tonight, we're going to talk about the video that I just posted up tonight, and it is the small block shootout between a Ford 351 Windsor, the Chevy Vortec 350, and the Dodge 360 Magnum. And a lot of guys are saying, yeah, but why didn't you include the Cleveland or an AMC or all these other things? First of all, this isn't 1970, so a Cleveland, I'm not going to find any of those in the wrecking yard. The other thing is the reason that this particular video was done is so I could compare all of the late model stuff. So the latest versions of the Dodge Magnum, the latest versions of the small block Chevy, not including obviously the Gen 2 stuff like the LT1 stuff, L99, that sort of thing. And also the one that kind of missed out on this whole deal was the 351 Windsor, the Ford, because it stopped earlier than the others did, and I pointed this out in the video, that they basically had more development. So the Vortec head was kind of the high water mark until we got to the Gen 2 stuff, kind of the high water mark for the traditional small block Chevy head. It worked very well. And it flows every bit as much as an earlier fuely head, if you want to call it that. The Magnum, not quite as good as maybe the best LA stuff, although stock for stock, I think that the Magnum head probably is the best one. It's not quite as good as the as modified versions or aftermarket versions of the LA head, but the stock Magnum head actually is pretty good. The lowest man on the cylinder head totem pole, and then obviously therefore the power totem pole, is the 351 Windsor, because those truck heads are just kind of pathetic. And yes, I know, and a lot of guys ask, well, why didn't you just put a GT40 head on there, which I certainly could. But I wanted to do this comparison stock versus stock. So we took a stock 351 from the wrecking yard, a stock 350 Vortec motor from the wrecking yard, and then a stock Magnum from the wrecking yard. The only thing that we did, as I explained in this video, I put a dual plane intake, carburetor, distributor, and long tube headers on all of them, only because I had never run the factory spider injection on the Vortec motor. Yeah, I could have done, and a lot of guys pointed this out, I could have done the Mercury Marine version of that motor with conventional injection, but that didn't come in a car. So I wanted to run them all comparable. So a dual plane manifold with a carburetor seemed like the best option, because a lot of guys would be using that and possibly putting that into a car that they might be swapping in. Because let's face it, a carbureted version of those motors is the easiest thing to swap into some other kind of swap application like that. So the dual plane stuff works well. And as I showed on the Dodge, if you compare a dual plane carbureted intake, especially in that case, the M1 dual plane, compared to the factory Kegger intake manifold for EFI, they're actually very comparable in power and torque. So it's really a pretty good example. Now, I don't know. I have run the factory Ford EFI for the 351 Windsor. I have never run the spider injection on a small block Ford on the engine, or for a small block Chevy, for a Vortec small block Chevy on the engine dyno. So I don't really know how well that does. I have run those motors a lot, probably a dozen or so, with carburation, because that's what we do. We take them out of the wrecking yard. We usually take most of the stuff off. We put a conventional distributor in there, put a conventional 4-barrel manifold on there, and then run it that way. And it usually works fairly well. And those are all, as I showed in the video, in terms of the small block, those are all near 300 horsepower. Some of them are a little bit more, some of them are a little bit less. Same thing with the Dodge. The few Dodges that I have run are all near 300 horsepower and 400 foot-pounds of torque. A lot of guys brought up, well, why didn't you use a Cleveland? Because the Windsor head is no good, as everybody knows, especially the production truck head. Excuse me. The reason that I didn't run a GT40 head is because, other than the very, limited production Lightning version of that motor, which also had the good intake manifold on it and was offered at 240 horsepower, they didn't use that GT40 head on the 351 on the 5.8 liter. They should have, because it would have made things a lot better. It shouldn't have just been a Lightning only version. It should have been all of them should have had that particular cylinder head, and ideally that intake manifold as well. because both of those were not good for producing power. So they could have stepped up to the power levels near the Magnum and the small block Chevy, although even with a GT40 head, they still don't flow what a good Magnum head or a small block Chevy has. So they have a lot more left in reserve compared to the Ford. But I wanted to do this stock for stock, the ones that I would find in the wrecking yard. We find lots of Magnums. There are lots of those small block Chevys. There are some of those 5.8 liter, not as many, probably as certainly not as many as the Magnums, but there are certainly 5.8 liter 351 Windsor trucks out there that to choose that motor from. The other thing is, what I got questions about what the early 351 Windsors use a hydraulic flat tapping cam. The later ones stepped up to hydraulic roller like they used in the 5 liter. The one that we used in the test was actually a hydraulic roller cam. So it was a later one. It was actually a 95. So it benefited from, if you can say that, from the hydraulic roller camshaft profile and the reduction in friction and whatever the cam timing is on that particular one versus the flat tapping cam. I don't know exactly what the changes were between those two camshafts, but either way, that particular motor did not perform nearly as well as I thought it should, and especially given its torque output or its rated torque output relative to the others. It was down in power, a fair bit, 45 horsepower compared to the small block Chevy in terms of power, but not down a lot in torque compared to the others. So it surprised me that it didn't do better in the torque production, even if it was down in the horsepower production, but it was down everywhere. And I've run a couple of those, and they've all been kind of down like that. So I want to run another one. My buddy Mark Sanchez has one, and we're going to run it. So I want to find out. And what I'll probably do is run the EFI version of that too, because even looking way back, I can't remember running the factory Ford truck manifold fuel injection on there. I may have done it once, but I can't swear to it. And I'd like to test it to make sure I find out. But we'll run it fuel injected and then maybe run it carbureted as well, to try to kind of do a comparison. So hopefully we get maybe a little bit better numbers on the Ford, but it's rated down from both of those anyway. So we know that it's going to be down. It just did not have the cylinder head flow that the others did. Even if the intake was comparable or the cam timing was comparable, it did not have cylinder heads that would do what the Ford or what the Chevy and the Dodge obviously were capable of. They kind of had the best production heads available. I know a lot of guys are going to say, oh, what about the 340? What about the J head or the X head or some guys call them a W2 head. It was not a W2 head in the 346 pack motor. It was basically the same 360 head, it just had bigger valves, and then it had offset rockers, which is very easy to do because all you have to do is space them over a little bit. It's not that hard to do. So they didn't have anything really special in terms of airflow from the head that was on the 340 on the 6-pack motor, and it was very, very rare. You're not going to find very many of those because they were very specific to that particular application. So the rest of them were just not anything spectacular. And a lot of guys wondered, well, if you were picking a Ford, why wouldn't you pick a Cleveland? Well, because this isn't the 1970s, and the Cleveland, at least for the U.S. market, was very, very limited. We didn't get them for a lot of years. They're really hard to find. I almost never see them in wrecking yards. I'll see lots of truck motors, obviously EFI truck motors. We will see a lot of those. Clevelands we won't see. And yes, I know especially the 4-valve Cleveland, if you find a 351 4-valve Cleveland, which again, I've probably seen one of those in the wrecking yard in the whole time I've been going. If you find one of those in the wrecking yard, few and far between, very rare, and it's not indicative of what the average guy can go get. The Magnum and the Chevy and this Ford are what, if I go to the wrecking yard, we'll find several of all of these, and they're easy to find. The Cleveland, not very much. We could find 2V Cleveland headed stuff, but more than likely it's not going to be a Cleveland. It's probably going to be a 351M or the 400. And again, not in a 351M or a 400 is not a small block in my opinion. The 351 Cleveland does classify as a small block, but again, from the early 70s. So the same reason I didn't use a Boss 351 or a Boss 302, I've done all those testing. In this video, I wanted to use all of the latest versions of the small block before everybody switched over to everything else. Dodge went to the Hemi, or they went to the 4.7, which a lot of people brought up as an intermediate kind of thing. Chevy went to the LT1 based stuff, the L99, and then went to the LS. And Ford went to the modular program from the 351 Windsor, which I thought was probably a bad choice. I think that they're, you know, because it's a 351 Windsor, there are lots and lots of heads available for them. And they could have made a lot more power comparable to the Mopar and to Chevrolet with starting with that. But they just elected not to do that. And I brought that up in the video that one was limited because it didn't have the same development years that the others did. The Vortec kept going. The Magnum, the 360 kept going, but Ford stopped and switched over to the modular thing, which, you know, arguably was not a good choice. So that's why we did that. And that's why I didn't include some people brought up AMCs, why I didn't include the Cleveland or a 302, and why I didn't include a 1969 351, because that's from the 60s. We wanted the latest versions that everybody could go find. I have never seen a 1969 351 Windsor in the wrecking yard ever, as long as I've been going there. So we would assume that based on that it's very, very rare. You see all the newer modern cars in there, and that's what you're going to find. And that's what most guys would choose from. That's what we would all start with. And then, and again, this was all stock, even though we put a carbureted intake manifold on them and a distributor and long tube headers. The rest of the motors were stock. I mean, they were all stock rockers, stock heads, stock cams, stock compression, stock long block, stock cam, you know, all of that stuff. So it was a fairly even-handed test, even though I ran them at different times. And we could have, you know, dialed it in a little bit more with it, where everybody gets an air gap and everybody gets exactly the same 750 carburetor. But again, in this power range, as I showed when we compared the Brawler carburetor to the Ultra XP, you know, double throwdown carburetor, there's very little power to be changed or to be had in this power range. I mean, we're talking 300 horsepower or less. So there's not a big change there. There is some change in the intake manifold, and we saw that when we did a recent test, like with the Magnum. We compared with the guys from Engine Masters, and you'll be seeing that video coming out, or the TV show coming out, where we compared the M1 dual plane, the Mopar Performance one, to the Edelbrock Performer RPM air gap, and there was a sizable change in power. The air gap offered a bit more than that M1, although the M1, you're going to be hard pressed to find it, and guys want a lot of money for it, even though it doesn't work as well as the other stuff that's out there. So same thing with the Chevy. There are lots of different dual plane intake manifolds available for that, and some of them that work very well. The RPM air gap is kind of the, you know, the intake by which all the others are measured. If you can do as well as that, you're doing fairly well. There are lots of them that have very similar design criteria, and they might do well for less money, but we didn't go through all of that. Same thing with the Windsor. The RPM air gap works really well, and there are a lot of other intake manifolds available for that are dual plane and, you know, 750 carburetor. Some people even mention the fact that why would you run a 750 on a stock motor? Well, on the engine dyno, it actually doesn't matter a great deal, because we're not looking for throttle response and stuff. And no, you're not going to get, oh, you're going to make a lot more torque with a 650. No, that's not actually what happens. What happens is you make, usually with the bigger carburetor, you make a little bit more peak power, but probably the throttle response, the drivability, wouldn't be as good. Again, we're not interested in that on the engine dyno. We are interested in it, but in this test, it had no effect. You're not going to make more low-speed power with a 650 instead of a 750, because the low-speed power is not determined really by the carburetor, as long as the signal is good. The one thing that you can do with a smaller carburetor is you can change the signal to the carburetor. So it's possible that you could get better fueling down low with the smaller carburetor if you need that, if the signal is not good enough. But on motors of this displacement, more so than on a 302, on the same power output 302 or 5-liter 305, or even a 318, although to a lesser extent on the 318, these are all big enough to have plenty of response for a 750, and it worked out very well. we could have run a 650 at this power level without any problem either. But these all ran with 750s because that's what we had at the time. The thing that most people didn't catch on to, and I talked about this in the video, is the fact that the biggest motor made the most low speed torque. Even if we include the most powerful Vortec 350 Chevy that I have run, the combination is going to affect that. The length of the runner on the intake, especially to some extent the cam timing, although down at 2000 RPM or 2500 RPM, the cam timing has less to do with the power production there. Compression definitely affects that. Long runners affect that. But the thing that affects it more than anything, more than either one of those, is actually displacement. So the Dodge, and maybe they did this on purpose, the Dodge being a 360 instead of a 350 or even 351 means that down low, when you first get into the throttle and you go to wide open throttle at a lower engine speed, it should make more torque. It's bigger, and that's what bigger motors do. If it were 370 inches or 80 or 90 or 400 inches, it would make even more low-speed power, even if you had the same cam and cylinder heads. It would do that because that's what displacement does. And that's the thing with the 360. And to some extent, if we were to compare a 318, not that the 318 is magic, and we've had lots of people tell me that, oh yeah, the 318, that's the giant killer. It's not. It's not anything. If you were to choose between a 318 and a 360, if you choose the 318, you will always get worked over by a 360. A 360 makes more power. It's bigger. It's supposed to do that. And nobody in any form of professional racing ever picks the smallest motor. The reason that every pro stock motor is 500 inches is because they won't allow them to make them 550 or 600 inches. If they did, everybody would pick the bigger motor. Same thing in Formula One, same thing in any form of professional motorsports. Whatever the limit is, that's what guys build. Nobody in Engine Masters or, like I said, in any form of professional motorsport says, oh, instead of a 500-inch pro stock motor, I'm going to build a 400-inch one that I can then rev higher and make more power. Nobody does that. And it's the same thing with a 318 versus a 360. A 360 will make more power than a 318. The only way for it not to do that is if you limit it some other way, like you put a very tiny cylinder head or a very tiny camshaft or a very tiny intake with a 2-barrel or something on there. Otherwise, even then, the 360 is going to make so much more torque than a 318 that it's just going to be better. So that's what they do. The one thing I can say about the 318 displacement compared to the competitors' near 5-liter displacement is if we look at it compared to the small blocks, we have a 305 because that would be the closest displacement for the later versions of the motor. Maybe a 327 would be a better comparison. In that case, a 327 would be better than a 318. They make more power than any 318 ever made. So it would be easy for a 327 Chevy to beat a 318. The 318, however, if you compare that to a 5-liter Ford or to a 305 Chevy, the 318 is bigger. So it has an advantage right there. And the same thing with the 360 compared to the 350 and 351. It's bigger, so it's going to start off making more torque. And again, if Dodge did that on purpose, I think that that's awesome. I think that they might have been thinking, hey, you know what we can do, even if we're limiting it with other things like head flow and cam timing and stuff, if ours is a little bit bigger, it's going to be a little bit better. So, kudos to the Dodge guys for thinking about that if they did, which I think is awesome. Cleveland, if we look at the Cleveland stuff, yes, a 4V Cleveland or even a 2V Cleveland would be a much better cylinder head choice than any of the Ford 351 Windsor stuff because none of those heads ever flowed very well. Even the much talked about 1969 351 Windsor head, which is what everybody went to, especially in ported versions, before they had any aftermarket heads for the Windsor, or you did a Cleveland head upgrade on it and you built a Clevor. Because a Cleveland head, right out all of the ones that I've flowed, stock one, a Boss 302, a 351 Cleveland 4V head, flows like 275 CFM, which is better than anything offered by Chevrolet or Dodge for their small blocks. None of those small blocks compare to what the Cleveland did. So from a high watermark standpoint, in terms of conventional small blocks, a Cleveland head is probably the epitome of cylinder head flow for any of those. Again, we didn't use that because it's not 1974 anymore, and we wanted to use all the modern versions. And Ford obviously said, hey, look, we're not going down the Cleveland path. We're going down the Windsor path, maybe for production or whatever. And so they don't have the head flow. Now, it's possible to swap all that stuff on there, and you certainly could do that. But this test wasn't about which one can make more power. This was about which one does make more power when we just run it in stock trim with our dual plane intake manifold. So this test was more about that than it's more about what is than what can be. Because then the problem with, okay, how much potential does it have? Well, there's up to 1 million heads for the small block Chevy, for the small block Ford, fewer for the Dodge. But all of those, if you look at the epitome of all these things, look at like NASCAR motors where they had to use, none of them are production valve angles, but if you look at production-based cylinder heads, they have heads that flow a ton and can make lots of power, whether it's a Ford, Chevy, or Dodge. Then it becomes, it's this displacement, and it's this much compression, and it's got this kind of cam timing, and it's got a head that flows 300, 350, 400, 450 CFM, whatever your altered valve angle and port dimension is, so then you get to where you're just chasing absolutes. And that's not what this was about. This was about average junkyard guy stuff. So I think this is more indicative of what it is after it's modified. There's lots of stuff. Everybody is saying that obviously the Chevy is better because it's cheaper and it's easier to modify. Again, was not the focus of this thing, because if I was talking about getting the least expensive performance motor out of the wrecking yard, it probably would be an LS. I mean, it takes a fairly heavily modified small block Chevy to make what a cammed LS does. I mean, if I go get a 5.3 or especially a 6-liter and I put a cam in it, I mean, you're talking about something that could make 500 horsepower. So think about what I'd have to do to make 500 horsepower from a small block Chevy or a small block Dodge or a small block Ford. You'd have to throw the kitchen sink at it to make that kind of power. And so from a cost standpoint, probably another route would be the way that I would go. And I just wanted to show on these 3 applications what happens when we do a carbureted intake on a Ford and Chevy and Dodge. And that's exactly what we did. And I thought it was a fairly good indication on what they do, with a possible exception of the Ford. I kind of would almost like to run another one of those to see if it's a little closer, at least in the torque production, if not the horsepower, like I said, based on the rated output. Although we don't know, the other thing I don't know about the Ford is what the difference is between the EFI version of the Ford and then the carbureted version of the Ford. Like, is the factory long runner intake? We know on all these that it holds it back at least somewhat. Like, what's the power change between those two things? So there's some good information and more testing to be done. I wrote up a story today for the guys at Summit Racing on the modifications done to the 3800 Series 3 V6 that we ran all of the modifications, the more boost and header and all that stuff on the V6. And then we ran the turbo on there. So that will be appearing on all cylinders before too long. I'm sure that will be out. That's an interesting deal. And then I've got more power from that motor coming up. So we're going to do a cam and hopefully ported heads. And then I'm sure I'm going to have to do, given the amount of boost that we were running, I'm going to have to do ring gap in this thing as well and find out. The other thing I want to do is put together that L67, because it's always nice to have let me go ahead and see if we can get this camera to cooperate here. Yeah. Boom. The L67, because it's nice to have a disposable one just in case we want to turn the boost all the way up, even before we actually do one that has ported heads and all that stuff. So lots of cool stuff coming up. We'll see what you guys have going on for you on this Friday night. And we'll see what kind of questions you guys have. And if you have any, please let me know. So Dan, what are you cheating by changing the correction factor? Because that's probably not a good idea. All of the smaller Chevys that I ran were junkyard motors. Cleveland is a street legal NASCAR motor. Probably not. $1.74 foot-pounds per cubic inch. That's a pretty big number. .2-liter Chevy versus 6.2-liter Ford. I think the 6.2-liter Ford, though, is going to be the truck motor, right? And a 6.2-liter Chevy is going to be LS3 based. Trans Am was only 5 liters, not 358 cubic inches. They allowed them after 1970 to de-stroke them, which is why Chevrolet no longer had to make the DZ302. They could actually make the LT1 in the Z28, and they could de-stroke that for Trans Am racing. Before that, they didn't allow that. They told them that they have to have a production 5-liter motor. Three VCHI heads are very good Cleveland heads, but again, a modified version of them. Ford's won Trans Am more often. Ford, in the heyday of Trans Am, Ford won twice and Chevrolet won twice. So more is not accurate. I do want to try the Trick Flow Cleveland heads, though. That would be interesting. I've never run those yet. Yes, the Ford offered the GT40 heads on the Lightning as well as the GT40 style intake Cobra. And it made 240 horsepower. So it would have been much more comparable with the 245 horsepower that was offered by the Magnum, and then also the 255 horsepower offered by the Vortex Chevy. But that was in such limited quantity that it's hard to find and not realistic. It would have been nice for me to include that upgraded version. Does anybody know if the Lightning cam was any different? An 88-pound injector might do 1,300 horsepower NA, but it's not going to do it under boost. Yes, the Can-Am cars were very, very cool. The small block Ford was not anywhere near king until the LS came out. And I have a 5-liter Mustang, which was an awesome car, but it was not, as we showed here. The AMC wasn't included because these were all modern small blocks. Did AMC make a modern small block that came out that was available in the 1990s or early 2000s? So you'll take your 340 over a 360 any day. That's good if you want to make if you want to have 20 less cubic inches and make that much less torque, then that works too. Mike, if you take a look at the video I have up, you can compare what a factory DZ302 does compared to a factory Boss 302. You can look at the power curves. The Boss is made more peak power. A stock Cleveland head doesn't flow as much as a modern LS head does. A modern LS3 head flows 315 CFM. A stock 4-valve, 4V, 4-barrel Cleveland head flows 275. So it's not the same head as an LS or an LS3. Michael, does a 1-inch spacer between the throttle body and manifold on a 351 EFI truck manifold help for towing? Probably not. It probably doesn't do anything. Dan, you want to see a budget 426 race Hemi build? How about a budget twin turbo Porsche build too? That would be kind of the same thing, right? The Terminator Cobra was one of the modular things I really like. So the AMC 360 was available up to and including the last year Grand Wagoneer in 1991. Between the 3 small blocks, which is the weak point? I don't know what the weak points are on those because I've never taken all of those to the breaking point. The only one I've done really a lot of power on is the Ford. I think that we've done some fairly high horsepower on the Chevy, and I haven't done any boosted stuff on the Dodge, so I'm not sure about that. Yeah, a ported 351 Cleveland head can flow pretty well, but it's going to have a really big port on it. What is the exhaust side flow on that Cleveland head? I have a stock 302 of my Maverick. What year is that? Like 73 or 4 or something? There's lots of cams for that. So Dan, you already have your budget Porsche turbo build going and you're waiting on your billet cams. So what's wrong with that statement? Would you ever do testing on a set of NASCAR heads? The guys from Westech actually have a couple of cup motors there. And the only thing that they've ever used them for that I know of is they've done some oil testing because I think that they belong to the guys from Lucas Oil. So they have done some of those things. I wouldn't ever take those motors apart. Uh, 200 intake 214. 200 214 actually is bigger than I thought on the Lightning. Overhead cam V8 showdown. Nathan, I think I would disagree with you on the problem with the 360 Magnum being the number of head bolts that they have. Take a look at a Ford, take a look at an LS. I mean, we have 10 whole head bolts on an LS, and we've done 1,540 horsepower. So I don't know that the head bolt number of head bolts is really a problem. With a turbo mounted wastegate. So you want to drill and tap the turbine housing or something for that? I think people only do that for fitment. Tyler, I have not heard of Work Monster. Turbo the NASCAR engine. Yeah, those are not mine. I would imagine those are pretty spendy too. Hollywood, I don't paint the inside of the blocks for mine because most of my stuff is junkyard anyway, and it's already all full of gunk, so the paint's not going to stick very well. 351 Cleveland heads for about 210 on the exhaust. Okay. One JZ versus RB25. I'd just like to get the RB25 running. Can we get an overhead cam showdown? Which overhead cam motor are you talking about, Admiral? Truck bedliner paint. A lot of guys use that Gliptol for the valley cover or for the valley area. K-Series Big Bang is coming. Admiral's referring to the LT5. Oh, yeah, the guys from Westech have one of those. We just haven't got it running yet. Mike Bell, you don't have to worry. If the injectors are flowing and working, you don't have to worry about any varnish buildup on them. Do you still have the stock high compression 464? No, I do not. Your Porsche heads flow 290 and 203? Wow. Yeah, whatever the limit is, you have to get all of it because every last centimeter, millimeter, nanometer of displacement is going to help you with power production. Yeah, Dan, those Mercury Marine motors are not cheap. Those are big money. Can you take a 5.4 out to 400 inches? I think that didn't the Engine Masters guys, I think Kazi and I think AccuFab has one of those motors that's like 400 inches. They have a 5.4 that they went out to that displacement. It made a lot of power. Would you all ever shell out the cash to test the V12 LS? That's funny. That's funny that you think I have cash if you're talking to me. The flathead Ford, I do have a couple of those that I can test, but not with a turbo, I don't think. Greg, a 221 cam and a 6-liter is going to be sub 500 horsepower, probably more like, I'm thinking 470. Tyler, it depends on how much power you want to make on your 2-valve. The trick flow heads are ultimately going to make more power, but they're obviously going to cost more. So you have to decide whether or not the extra power that they're offered. And again, you have to have the other things that go along with that to take advantage of what that head has to offer. Do you have the cubic inches and compression and cam timing and intake manifold and RPM capability to take advantage of what that head can do? If you have a 400 horsepower cam and those heads will support 500 horsepower, then there's no need for you to get those heads because something else is holding them back. Mike, I haven't tested the Trick Flow Mopar heads yet. Hollywood, I have done lots of stuff with the guys from Schneider Racing. They've made a number of cams for us for various Bonneville projects and stuff. And every cam that I've ever gotten for them worked fantastic. BJ, the reason people paint the inside of the engine is to aid drain back. What they're doing is making the surface slippery so that the oil drains back into the pan as quickly as possible to make sure that you don't have oil starvation to the pump. How much are port heads worth on a turbo engine? Sometimes nothing. Andy, I have seen the people have mentioned that and sent me photos of the big block V6 stuff. I've never run one though. And there's no reason that a 3-valve modular Ford cannot make 1,000 horsepower. We've done it with a 2-valve, and we've done it with more than that with 4 valves. So the 3-valve can easily do that. It has enough cylinder head already. Put a camshaft in it, ring gap. Excuse me. They have really good intakes, and then add boost. Given the power curve of the 3800 supercharged motor with a turbo, can you think of a way to mimic that with a cam head combo that makes the low power grunt until the turbo makes up for it on the top end? You're not going to be able to do that without the blower, if that's what you're talking about. If you're talking about just running a turbo and then trying to enhance the NA power output, you're not going to do that, because that's one thing that a positive displacement blower does very well, is it adds lots of low-speed power. When we run this thing NA, you'll be able to see the difference. I mean, this thing is going to make 170 or 80 horsepower, something like that, NA. It's not going to make a ton. And then subsequently, especially with the GT45, we are going to see that this thing is not very responsive just in turbo-only version. TFS build 375 stroke Cleveland, 524 horsepower. That's good power. Have you ever blown a motor due to an oil filter failure? No, I never hurt the motor because of that. We have blown filters apart because I think that the bypass valve was stuck or something. We got a lot of pressure buildup in the filter, and it just blew the filter apart. When we put a new filter on, all of that was cured, but I haven't blown up a motor because of that. Can a 351 with a turbo be made for towing? Yes. You want to do 1,000 horsepower on a 3-valve without boost? Nah, no, I'll pass on that. I don't know what the next sets are going to be. Probably more with the 3800 and the Magnum, because those are ready to go. Although I want to get back on the 4200 as well. So you want to see a 5.42 valve make 1,000 horsepower without boost? Good luck with that. You want a big compressor side for the Atmo turbo on a compound. This is a turbo supercharged compound. So we're taking the turbo and blowing into the blower. No, Admiral, I don't have that challenge. I'm not interested in that. Building all motor stuff that's really high horsepower gets like, extreme levels of orders of magnitude more and more expensive. And I have absolutely zero interest in spending $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 on a naturally aspirated motor that makes 1,000 horsepower when I can go to the wrecking yard and put something like that together for like $1,000. Have you ever heard of companies making solutions to valve springs for excessive RPMs? Yeah, you can do free valve stuff. What's the highest horsepower 2-bolt main engine you've seen? I want to think some of the big blocks we've done with boost on them have been near 4 digits, but I can't swear to that. I don't do much with diesel engines. We never do them on the engine dyno. So everybody make sure, stop what you're doing, hit the like button. We got lots of people here, but not a lot of likes. Any chance to see a Big Bang 2-valve 5.4? Probably not. That would be really, really low on the list. I sent Tony a text and reached out to him. I haven't heard anything from him. Would a 4.62 valve hold 600 horsepower with scat H-beam rods and hyper-eutectic pistons at 15 pounds of boost? Yeah, very easily. I mean, that's not going to be a problem at all. We've done that with stock stuff, so having forged stuff will be no problem. 1,400 horsepower boosted mod motors are no problem. Hovitz does that kind of stuff all the time. As a matter of fact, way beyond that. Yeah, I don't know what Tony's still. He's emotionally invested in he's angry that the results came out the way that the results came out, and so he takes that, I think, as a slight to him for some reason. I don't really know why, but trying to have a discussion with somebody that's emotionally unstable is not beneficial to either parties. Yeah, I don't ever see any 6.4 Hemis in the junkyard. We do see some 5.7 stuff, or early stuff, occasionally. Staying, you're always going to have a trade-off. Guys want everything. So they want, I want to make as much power as possible, but it's got to also idle like stock. Well, you can't have both of those things. You have to have some of this or some of this and some combination of that. There are camshafts that you can get that will add power everywhere from 2000 RPM all the way to the top. But you're not going to add as much power as you could if you said, hey, look, I'm willing to give up the idle quality and you know, trade that off for what I would get on the top end power. And that's inherent in any sort of camshaft. There's nobody that can do something different than that. Hollywood, every V8 that I've known has, every motor that I've known has required extra ring gap from the factory because they put the amount of ring gap in that's required to work for an actually aspirated combination under their range of, you know, of operation that they decide that this thing should work in. And one of the things that they're thinking about is never, okay, they're going to run 15 pounds of boost on this thing forever. So they usually require a lot more ring gap, something in the neighborhood of around 7 thousandths or so per inch of bore. So you can apply that to any motor. You got to milk this thing. I'm not interested in doing that. That's not why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm not doing it for likes and stuff. I don't have a 392 Hemis to do testing on, so I can't do any testing on that. Well, and somebody mentioned the thing about Uncle Tony, and the reality is that I'm not saying because we did one test that that's absolute. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that I wanted to talk to him about. There are other ways to measure things like on the chassis dyno or change the rate of acceleration on the engine dyno. We could test it on different combinations. There's lots of other tests that would need to be done for anybody, on any of us, to be able to say, hey, look, this isn't a thing, or this absolutely is a thing. My whole discussion with all of this has been, I'm 100% neutral. I just wanted to find out what it does. I told Tony that from our first meeting, I'm going to test this. Doesn't matter to me what you say. Doesn't matter to me what other people say. I'm going to test it because I want to know for me. If somebody asks me, I need to be able to tell them, hey, look, when we tested it, here's what happened. I have data. I don't have an opinion. And, you know, he's taking it as something else. He's taking it as a slight or an attack on him, or whatever his issue is just silly. Same thing would be on the other side. If anybody said, look, you know, if we tested it and it showed power, if they said, oh, you guys don't know what you're doing, you're idiots, there's no power, I would say the same thing to them. They have a vested interest in it for whatever reason. They've attached their ego to it, which is exactly what Tony has done. And I don't do that to data. The data is just the data, and it says what happened. And for me, all it meant is there's a lot more to talk about, and that's why I reached out to him before he went on his Tom Cruise tirade on the couch. Before he did any of that, I reached out to him. I reached out to Dave. I did everything that I could to say, hey, look, let's get together, because there's a lot more cool things to talk about, especially chassis dyno testing, especially changing the rate of acceleration, different combinations, whatever. There's lots more things and that's what usually happens with dyno testing. Whenever we dyno test one thing, we don't hardly ever get an absolute answer, except that this cam did this and this cam did this, but it only did that on that combination. It would do something a little bit different on other combinations. But what it does is always like open up a lot more questions. Hey, well, what about this? Or what about this? Or what about this? And that's what my discussion was going to be. I don't need to get a factory engineer to talk about piston offset. I know why the factory does piston offset, but I would want to see actual back-to-back data. That's why I want that. We talked to Billy Godbold, we talked to the piston manufacturers, we talked to the rod manufacturers, we talked to lots of really, really sharp people. But unless somebody gave me when we tested this back-to-back, like we did, what they're giving me is not data. They're still giving me opinion. Yeah, ProCharge Moper, there's no way, and this is one of the things I want to talk to him about, and what I wanted to talk to David Weishart about is I can't invite people onto my live chat because I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to have multiple people on the screen yet. It's something that I want to do, but I don't know how to do that. So again, he's saying that I should have done that and I could have done that, but I can't. If he's able to do that, that's good on him, but I'm not able to do that. So there's nothing that I could have done. I didn't invite David on to be on my show, although if I could do that, I definitely would. And I would invite Tony as well. But I asked David to tell him, look, when can we be on the show to talk about the results of this thing so we can all get together? But he, his agenda is that he wants people to be attacking him so that he can huddle around with all of his guys and say, hey, look, woe is me. And these guys are after me. And look how, it's just a bunch of nonsense. Steve, I watched his video where he flipped out. So I watched that whole video. Smokey would do anything to gaslight another crew. And that's the thing. Smokey has a reputation of doing stuff like that. It's not a video, but the TV show this was all done for Engine Masters TV. So that's where it's coming out. Freiberger posted the results. The data already exists on David Freiberger's. I think he did it on Facebook and he might've also done it on Instagram. But it just shows the overlay is exactly perfect within 1 horsepower or less than 1 horsepower. So it repeated perfectly from 3 runs that we made back to back before we did the piston flip to 3 runs that we made after the piston flip, and they're just identical. There's really no change in power. What rings would you recommend for a 462 valve to handle 15 psi Dopax and Nobi 1000s? Well, if you have a stock piston, I would recommend the stock ones, but I would put extra ring gap in it. We'd run it around 28 to 30 thousandths. Yeah, Jay, that's assuming that people go by the scientific method. But if you have somebody typically that doesn't like data is suspect to me. Somebody that doesn't want more information is suspect to me. So if we can, like, if we would have run it and it would have made 10 horsepower, I'd be the first guy to, nothing would have changed from what I did. I still would have reached out to Tony. I still would have reached out to David. I would have asked them when we could be on the show so we could talk about all this. The only thing that would have been different is Tony wouldn't have flipped out on his show and accused people of doing stuff because it would have gone the way that he wanted. And so that's what shows me a little bit about him. And it's unfortunate. Yeah, more data is always good. And I would want somebody else to do this test or that maybe has done this test, like Joe Sherman or somebody, and show me their data. And I'd like to take a look at it. Obviously, we would peruse it with to make sure that everything was on the up and up, but not specifically for Joe Sherman. I know because I know what he does and he does good work. but I would like to see the data and find out. Yeah, the wait till you see the Engine Masters thing, the whiteboard thing comes into play there. I do like Total Seal rings. We use a lot of their stuff. Maybe not necessarily a gapless ring, but the Total Seal stuff, they make more than gapless rings. I've seen the LS 351 headed stuff. A Toyota 22R would be awesome, and I have one more minute and then I have to get going. I do like Invisible Space Aliens and Ghost and Big Feet. We have tested adjusting the 4.6 liter 2-valve cams. We didn't advance and retard them. What I did was ran them the way that they came, and then we checked them, and then we made them both the same side to side because they were off quite a bit. So when we made them the same, then it changed the power output. you're a Yeti American and you're offended by big feet. I was just trying to use the plural form. Duke's Mopar, the cam that we use on the Magnum would work with anything. Would work with a turbo, with a torque storm. The torque storm is just going to add power to whatever is there. Brenton, we calculated the change in cam timing, but again, since the motor repeated within 1 horsepower, which is the range of repeatability of a just back-to-back test, there was no change in power. So it doesn't matter what your speculation is or what your calculation is. That's why we did the test. We looked at all of that. We looked at the change in cam timing. We looked at the change in compression height. We looked at the change in piston position relative to peak cylinder pressure. I mean, we looked at everything. We looked at change in thrust loading, all of that. There were lots of things that changed when we did this. And that's why, especially Freiberger and Dulce, more Freiberger than Dulcich, but both of them went down the rabbit hole contacting all these people to find out. And Billy Godbold gave us acceleration curves for the pistons before and after with the change in offset on the pin. We got a lot of data, and there were a lot of things that changed. The one thing that didn't change was the power, because all these other things changed in such an insignificant amount. Why would people run different rocker ratios for the intake versus the exhaust? For a couple of reasons. One, a lot of times the same way that they do with cam timing, they're trying to offset the difference, the flow variance between the intake side and the exhaust side. There's always going to be a difference. So they're trying to sometimes artificially enhance the intake side. The other thing that people can do with rocker ratios is they can adjust them for different runner lengths, which we've tried when I was doing Engine Masters. If you have a single plane intake manifold, you will try different rocker ratios on the intake and or the exhaust for the different runner lengths. Comp obviously now has their 4-pattern cams specifically for that, but rocker ratios were done before that to try to crutch something that's going on with the intake manifold. So Oscar, I don't know how to evaluate throttle response on that. Yeah, Brenton, we understand the nature of the change. We understand all of the things that it changes. Yeah, Ark, I want to see you flip your EEPROM. I want to see how well that works out. The guys from Speedmaster have Magnum heads. They have both aluminum and iron versions, although their aluminum version is an LA/Magnum head. Yeah, Tim, that's the only thing we can do. And that was going to be my suggestion, is that we look at this in terms of one, a change in acceleration rate on the engine dyno, but on the chassis dyno, we could run it from a much lower speed. And then any change that we would see in throttle response could be identified on a chassis dyno because we could nail the throttle. And then the rate of acceleration of the fixed diameter and weight roller would be determined by any sort of change in power production that would come from any sort of change that would happen in the engine. So on a chassis dyno, it might be more receptive to that if there is something there. Okay, guys, I got to get going. It is time to go. It's Friday night. Come on. I've actually already been to happy hour with my wife. We had a great time. I got back early enough so that I could come back and talk to you guys. Hopefully everybody has a good weekend. I will see you all tomorrow. And hopefully all of you guys have already taken a look at the video that's up and argued back and forth about the Ford, Chevy, Dodge thing. It amazes me that during the video, I tell people, look, they all did kind of the same thing and they all work very well. And the big motor made the most torque. Not anything, not any of this huge revelation. But nobody sees that. All they see is Ford, Chevy, Dodge. The Ford is the best. The Chevy is the best. The Dodge is the best. It's just another reason for people to argue. Thanks, guys. I will see you all tomorrow.